Egypt, the land of gold and stone, the land of gods walking as men. When we picture ancient Egypt, we see monuments of glory, the pyramids rising into the sky, the Nile flowing endlessly, carrying life across the desert, pharaohs in golden crowns, ruling as divine kings, temples glowing with incense, priests chanting beneath the gaze of eternal statues. This is the image carved into memory. Splendor, majesty, civilization at its peak. But beneath the golden light, there were shadows. And in those shadows lay truths never meant to be told. Egypt was not only a land of glory, it was a land of fear, a land of blood rituals, secret ceremonies, and punishments performed in the name of gods who demanded silence and submission. Pharaohs ruled not only with power but with terror sanctified as holy law. And what was hidden from official records was sometimes darker than the desert nights themselves. The forbidden rituals of ancient Egypt were not ceremonies of beauty. They were acts of dominance, acts that used suffering as an offering, acts that turned torture into devotion, and death into a sacred necessity. Imagine stepping inside a temple at midnight. The walls echo with chants, torches flicker, shadows dancing across hieroglyphs carved thousands of years ago. In the center, priests surround a bound figure. Their voices rise in unison. The drums beat slowly, like a heart, and then the ritual begins. These were not rituals for the people to see. They were performed behind closed doors, guarded by silence and fear. Those who took part swore secrecy, their lives tied to the gods and to the pharaoh. But traces remain. Whispers carved in hidden texts, tomb paintings that speak of ceremonies too strange to be ordinary worship. Archaeological hints of blood spilled in places meant only for prayer. The line between faith and fear blurred. To appease the gods was to suffer. To prove devotion was to bleed. Pharaohs were seen as gods themselves. Their word was eternal law. Their will was unquestionable. To serve them was to serve eternity. But to defy them openly or in secret was to invite a fate worse than death. The rituals ensured that no one forgot. Some ceremonies demanded sacrifice. Prisoners of war brought to temples, not for execution, but for sanctification through agony. Their blood poured onto sacred altars, believed to strengthen the divine aura of the pharaoh. Their screams echoed like offerings, swallowed by walls that still stand today. Other rituals were quieter, but no less horrific. Servants buried alive beside their masters. Guards poisoned to follow their pharaoh into the afterlife. Women sealed into tombs so their voices could protect the dead forever. These were not legends. These were deliberate acts of devotion, twisted into cruelty. Egypt's monuments speak of eternity, but eternity, for some, came at the cost of suffering beyond imagination. The grandeur of pyramids was built on bones. The walls of temples were consecrated not only with incense, but with pain. What was displayed to the world was majesty. What was hidden in the sand was brutality. The rituals were forbidden for a reason. They revealed the face of power unmasked. Pharaohs who demanded more than loyalty. Gods who demanded more than prayer. Fear itself became the greatest altar in Egypt, fed with blood, silence, and obedience. Yet we know only fragments. Much was erased. Priests destroyed records, rulers erased names, secrets buried beneath layers of sand and stone. And still, the shadows of these rituals linger. A glimpse here, a carving there, whispers that refuse to die. For every story carved in golden relief, there is another story carved in silence. The silence of victims whose suffering was called sacred. The silence of rituals no scribe dared to record. The silence of gods who demanded torment in exchange for eternity. This is where the journey begins. Not in the light of the pyramids, not in the flowing waters of the Nile, but in the darkness beneath the sand. A darkness where rituals of fear were performed under the gaze of gods who never blinked. And if this is what we know, only fragments and whispers, imagine what still lies hidden. To understand the forbidden rituals, we must first understand the pharaoh. He was not just a ruler, he was a god in flesh. His crown gleamed with sunlight, his word carried the weight of eternity. When he spoke, the people obeyed. When he commanded, the Nile itself seemed to rise in answer. Pharaoh was not a man to his subjects. He was the divine made real. This power was not symbolic. It was absolute. The Pharaoh held dominion over life and death, body and soul. Priests declared that he was chosen by the gods, and that every decree was sacred truth. To resist him was not only treason, it was blasphemy. To defy the Pharaoh was to defy the universe itself. This divine authority gave Egypt its order. Temples shone as houses of gods. Laws were proclaimed as heavenly decrees. And rituals, those ceremonies that blurred the line between faith and terror, were justified as necessary for balance. The Pharaoh was Ma'at, the cosmic order embodied. And if balance required blood, then blood would flow. Imagine standing in a temple courtyard, sun blazing on sandstone walls. Statues of Horus, Isis, and Ra loom above. Priests chant hymns that echo against the stone. In the center, the Pharaoh appears, robed in gold and white, face hidden beneath the sacred cobra crown. To the people watching, this is no man. This is eternity in human form. His gestures are divine. His silence is divine. Even his punishments are divine. But divinity has its shadows. Because when one man becomes a god, his cruelty also becomes sacred. His anger is seen as justice, his vengeance as divine will. And through this belief, fear was sanctified. The priests ensured it. Their voices filled with hymns, their rituals cloaked in incense and secrecy. They whispered that the gods required devotion, not only in worship but in obedience. They taught that purity demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice demanded pain. The people obeyed. They worked the fields, built the temples, paid their offerings. They sang hymns and prayed for mercy. But they also knew that mercy was not always given. One misstep, one accusation, could mean condemnation. Rituals of punishment were as holy as rituals of harvest. Some ceremonies were public, designed to remind the crowd of their place. A thief lashed beneath the temple steps. A servant humiliated in front of statues older than memory. Pain became a spectacle, sanctified by prayer. Others were secret, hidden deep within temple walls or beneath the sands. These were the rituals no one dared to describe. Whispers tell of priests dragging prisoners into chambers carved with forbidden symbols. Torches flickered on walls painted with serpents and suns. Blood offerings poured into bowls of alabaster, offered to gods who demanded silence more than mercy. Victims vanished, their names erased, their suffering written into eternity as nameless devotion. For the Pharaoh, these acts were not cruelty. They were order. They were balance. They were demonstrations that fear itself was divine. And so, the people accepted them. Because how could they resist? To question was to invite wrath. To doubt was to invite ruin. Pharaoh's power was not simply political. It was spiritual, eternal, and absolute. His rituals were the fabric of reality itself. But power has hunger. The more it is used, the more it demands. Rituals of devotion became rituals of dominance. Ceremonies of purity turned into ceremonies of terror. The boundary between worship and torture dissolved into smoke and blood. Egypt's glory stood upon foundations built not only of stone, but of silence and obedience. Temples that dazzled the world also hid chambers of dread. Priests who blessed harvests also blessed punishments. And pharaohs who ruled as gods demanded offerings that no mortal could give without suffering. The Nile carried life, but it also carried whispers of death. Every flood brought new grain, but perhaps it also washed away traces of rituals never meant to be seen. This was the paradox of Egypt, a land of majesty, cloaked in beauty, yet soaked in fear. A civilization that carved eternity into stone, yet demanded pain as its hidden. Blood was not only spilled in Egypt's wars, it was spilled in its temples. To the ancient Egyptians, life itself was a gift from the gods, and what was given could also be taken away. Sacrifice was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as balance, an offering of flesh and blood to maintain order, to strengthen the pharaoh, and to keep the Nile flowing. But these sacrifices were never meant to be spoken of. They were hidden beneath layers of incense and prayer, performed at night, carried out by priests whose chants drowned out the screams of the condemned. Imagine the scene: a chamber lit by flickering torches, shadows stretching across walls painted with jackals and falcons. At the center, a bound prisoner kneels before an altar of polished stone. Priests circle him, their voices rising in low, rhythmic chants. The air is thick with smoke and fear. The knife gleams, and then the ritual begins. Prisoners of war were the most common victims. Captives brought from distant lands, Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics, forced into servitude. Many were worked to death in quarries or fields, but some were chosen for more sacred fates. Their blood poured onto altars, their lives extinguished not for punishment, but for offering. Their deaths were believed to empower the pharaoh, to strengthen his divine link to the gods. Sometimes servants and attendants were chosen. When a pharaoh died, those closest to him did not always live on. They were buried beside him, killed in ritual to accompany their master into eternity. Their loyalty extended beyond life, sealed by sacrifice. Accounts speak of retainers strangled, poisoned, or stabbed, their bodies placed in tombs alongside their king. In Abydos, archaeologists uncovered graves surrounding royal burials, hundreds of young men and women interred at the same time as their ruler. Not all died naturally. Many were killed, willingly or otherwise, in rituals of devotion. Sacrifice was not always about death. Sometimes it was about pain. Ritual lashings were believed to purify the body and soul. Blood drawn by the whip was seen as cleansing, as if the pain itself was an offering to the gods. Victims staggered beneath the blows, their cries muffled by chants, and still the priests called it holy. There were also darker whispers, ceremonies where children were offered, where innocence itself was seen as the purest gift to the divine. Evidence is scarce, buried under sand and silence. But hints remain in forbidden texts, in symbols etched hastily into hidden walls. Whispers of rituals so horrific that even the conquerors who wrote of Egypt shuddered to record them. Each act was cloaked in sacred language. Every cut, every scream, every drop of blood was framed as devotion. Ritual murder was transformed into worship. Torture became transcendence. And those who watched learned that to serve the gods was to fear them. These rituals were not accidents. They were deliberate. They reinforced the pharaoh's divinity. They reminded the people that life was not theirs to claim. It belonged to the gods, and the gods spoke through their king. The victims of these ceremonies became nameless offerings. Their blood stained the stone. Their voices vanished into silence. But their deaths were recorded not in words, but in fear. Fear that gripped the living, forcing obedience through terror, sanctified as holy truth. The Nile itself became part of the ritual. Blood poured into its waters was thought to carry messages to the gods, flowing from earth to eternity. The river gave life, it also carried death. And each season's flood reminded the people that sacrifice, like water, was part of the eternal cycle. But the hunger for blood was never satisfied. The rituals grew more elaborate, more secret, more horrific. What began as offerings of prisoners became ceremonies involving servants, guards, even wives. The closer one was to the pharaoh, the greater the risk of being chosen for sacrifice. Loyalty was rewarded with eternity through death. Egypt's glory shone in the sunlight, but its darkness thrived in shadow. The grandeur of temples masked the screams of victims. The gold of crowns concealed the red of blood, and all was justified as sacred. Sacrifice was power, and power was never gentle. But blood was only one part of the story. Egypt's rituals did not always kill. Some were designed to prolong suffering, to turn pain itself into an offering, and those ceremonies were even more terrifying. Blood was not the only offering. Pain itself was sacred. The Egyptians believed that suffering could purify, that agony could cleanse the soul, just as fire burned away impurity. And so, the rituals of pain became ceremonies of devotion. They were not always meant to kill. They were meant to break. Forced labor was the most common form. Men dragged stones across the desert, their backs bent, skin torn by whips. Under the burning sun, their sweat was called an offering. Every lash of the whip was framed as purification. Each drop of blood sanctified the work. These punishments were not only for criminals, they were for those accused of impurity. And the temple walls stood as silent witnesses to their torment. But there were more ritualized instruments, objects forged not only for control, but for ceremony. Iron shackles clamped around wrists and ankles, binding bodies to altars. Ropes tightened around chests and throats until breath became prayer. Wooden poles bent spines backward, stretching limbs to the point of breaking. These tools were not simply punishments. They were instruments of ritual. Whips tipped with bone or metal tore through flesh, leaving marks meant to resemble sacred symbols. Priests read the wounds like scripture, claiming the gods had spoken through the cuts. Victims became living texts, their suffering interpreted as divine messages. Other devices were cruder, but no less ceremonial. Stones placed on the chest until breathing slowed, the crushing weight seen as a sacrifice of air itself. Heated bronze applied to skin, burning flesh in spirals that resembled the Sunday. The screams were muffled by chanting, transformed into hymns of devotion. Even water was used, victims held beneath the Nile's surface, struggling, choking, drowning. Pulled back at the last moment, only to be plunged again. The ritual was called cleansing. The priest said the gods demanded impurity be washed away. But the water was not gentle. It was suffocating. Each breath stolen was another offering. Some ceremonies focused not on death or even suffering, but humiliation. Prisoners stripped naked, paraded before crowds, their heads forced low, their dignity torn away. Shackles were heavy, but shame was heavier. The people watched. The message was clear. Obedience was salvation. Defiance was humiliation. These acts blurred the line between punishment and prayer. They were not carried out in hidden chambers alone. Sometimes they were public, staged beneath towering statues of gods. The people saw with their own eyes. They learned that to serve the gods was to fear them. Imagine standing in a temple court as the sun sets. Torches flare. Priests in linen robes chant in unison. At the center, a prisoner is bound. The whip cracks. The crowd gasps. And the priests declare that purity has been restored. The victim collapses, but the ritual is complete. Pain was framed as balance, torture as order. In the language of the priests, cruelty was not cruelty. It was devotion. The gods demanded suffering, and the Pharaoh, as their living image, ensured that it was given. For the victims, there was no escape. Death was sometimes merciful. Survival meant scars on the body, on the spirit. Scars that reminded everyone who saw them of the cost of defiance. Scars that became sermons written on flesh. The forbidden rituals of pain did not vanish with a single ceremony. They repeated, again and again, across centuries. Their echoes are still found in tomb paintings and inscriptions that scholars debate to this day. Symbols that look like hymns may also be records of torment. Reliefs that show offerings may also depict sacrifice through suffering. The truth is clouded, deliberately hidden. But the fragments we glimpse reveal a system where pain itself was worship. Egypt's glory concealed this darkness well. The monuments dazzled with light. The rituals thrived in shadow. Together, they built a civilization that endured for thousands of years. But even the greatest monuments crumble. Sand buries temples. Time erases names. Still, whispers of these ceremonies linger. The tools of pain rust away, but the memory of their purpose remains. And in the tombs of the pharaohs, death rituals carried this cruelty even further. Because if the living were made to suffer for purity, what was demanded for the dead was far more terrifying. Death was never the end in Egypt. It was only the beginning. The pharaoh's tomb was not just a resting place. It was a kingdom of eternity. Carved into stone, painted with color, filled with treasures of gold, it was meant to carry the ruler beyond life itself. But these tombs were not only built with devotion, they were built with blood. The journey of a pharaoh into the afterlife was guided by rituals. Rituals that demanded offerings, sacrifices, and silence. To ensure the king's passage into eternity, lives were taken, servants, guards, and sometimes even family were chosen to accompany their master into the next world. They did not go willingly. They went because the gods demanded it, or so the priests claimed. In Abydos, entire groups of retainers were buried alongside their rulers. Dozens of graves surrounding the pharaoh's tomb, all sealed on the same day. The evidence is clear. They did not die naturally. They were killed in ritual. Strangled, poisoned, stabbed. Their deaths ensured that the king would not be alone in the afterlife. Their loyalty extended beyond life, forced into eternity. Some were buried alive, entombed in chambers with food and water, left to die slowly in darkness, their cries silenced by stone. Others were drugged, their lives slipping away as they were placed beside their master. For the pharaoh, this was honor. For the victims, it was terror disguised as devotion. The rituals did not stop with people. Animals, too, were sacrificed. Horses, dogs, even sacred cattle were killed to accompany the dead. Mummified and placed beside their masters, they were meant to serve forever. The tombs became prisons of silence, filled with the dead who had no choice. And then there were the curses. Hieroglyphs carved into walls warned intruders of death. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's peace. These words were not mere threats. They were part of the ritual. Priests invoked spells to bind the tomb, to fill it with power that would strike down trespassers. Poisonous traps may have been laid. Disease spread through sealed chambers may have been deliberate. The line between myth and reality is thin, but the fear was real. Imagine stepping into a tomb as a grave robber, the air heavy with dust, the walls glowing with torchlight. Strange figures, painted in red and black, stare back at you, and in the silence, you remember the curse carved above the door. Was it only words? Or had you just sealed your fate? The curses extended beyond thieves. They were warnings to the living, too. A reminder that the pharaoh's power did not end with death, that even in the grave, his reach was eternal. Rituals of death blurred the line between devotion and domination. To serve the pharaoh was to serve him forever, in this life and the next. His tomb was not just a monument, it was a fortress of fear, designed to terrify even centuries later. The grandeur of these rituals concealed their cruelty. To the people, they were holy acts. To the victims, they were chains. Chains that bound them to eternity, whether they wished it or not. But the dead were not the only ones to suffer. The tomb rituals echoed into the lives of the living. Families lost sons and daughters to the service of death. Villages whispered of disappearances tied to the building of tombs. Fear spread, as deep as the desert sands. Egypt built monuments of stone, but it also built monuments of silence. Silence forced on those who dared not question. Silence buried with the victims whose names were erased. Silence that endured for thousands of years. And yet, Egypt was not alone. Across the world, in distant lands, other civilizations performed their own rituals of blood and fear. The patterns repeat different gods, different symbols, but the same cruelty sanctified as divine. And when we look beyond Egypt's deserts, we find echoes of its forbidden practices in empires far away. Egypt was not alone. Its darkness had mirrors. Across oceans and centuries, other empires bound power to pain. They called it faith. They called it justice. They called it order. The names changed. The method did not. Begin in Mesopotamia, where cities rose from mud and law was carved into stone. There, ordeals tested truth with water and fire. The accused were thrown into rivers. If the gods saved them, they were innocent. If they drowned, the verdict stood. Pens wrote decrees. Rituals enforced them. Pain translated the will of heaven into the language of fear. In Assyria, kings wrote history in iron. Prisoners were flayed and displayed on city walls. Heads were piled into pyramids at the gates. These scenes were not random. They were rites of terror, performed publicly, recorded carefully, justified as divine victory. An empire preached obedience with the same voice it used for prayer. The temple stood beside the scaffold. The hymn followed the scream, "Travel west." Greece spoke of reason, but its shadows remembered blood. In Sparta, boys were scourged at the altar of Orthia. The ritual was called endurance. It was also pain. At Delphi, oracles whispered fate through vapors and riddles, and city-states marched to war, believing Apollo had spoken. When power borrows the voice of a god, choices vanish. Only obedience remains. Rome perfected the theater of punishment. Crucifixion lined the roads. Gladiators bled for glory while the crowd roared. Executions were scheduled like festivals, framed as order restored, empire defended, gods appeased. The message was simple: honor the law, fear the lash, worship the eagle, or suffer beneath it. Rome did not hide its rituals. It advertised them. Across the sea, among the Aztecs, sacrifice was the heartbeat of empire. Priests opened chests on temple tops, offering hearts to the sun so day would not die. Captives climbed the stairs in painted procession, their steps measured, their fates decided. The ritual-bound city, calendar, and cosmos. It was not cruelty in their eyes. It was balance, and balance required blood. Among the Maya, the king drew thorns through his flesh to summon sacred visions. Queens pulled ropes of barbed fiber through the tongue to open the door to gods. Blood was the bridge. Pain was the key. Ritual became a language. The heavens could hear an echo of Egypt's belief that suffering purified and sustained the world. Far north, other traditions carved fear into justice. Among some Germanic tribes, trial by combat turned guilt into survival. The gods would guide the victor, they said. The loser confessed with his body. In medieval Europe, later still, ordeals returned under Christian forms: hot iron, cold water, chains buried beneath cathedrals. Another story for another time, yet the pattern is familiar. In India's deep past, ascetics embraced heat and hunger to break the body and elevate the soul. Firewalks, vows of silence, long fasts. Most were paths of devotion, not punishment. And yet, the principle rhymed. The idea that pain clears a path to the divine, Egypt would have understood. China wrote its own script of fear: public executions in market squares, exemplary punishments to teach the crowd. The law was a living thing that demanded theater. Officials recorded, witnesses watched, and order was born again in a ritual of dread. Confucian virtue stood in sunlight. Legalist severity stalked in shadow. Together, they kept the empire still. Even the great empires of faith learned this tongue. Byzantine courts staged amputations as lawful spectacle. Caliphal capitals balanced poetry and punishment in the same plazas. The sacred hosted the severe, and the crowd learned the lesson the ruling class wanted them to keep. Stability rests on obedience, and obedience grows in the soil of fear. What, then, separates Egypt? Not cruelty alone. Cruelty is common. What set Egypt apart was the intimacy of the bond between divinity and rule. The pharaoh was not the god's servant. He was their embodiment. When the whip cracked, the gods themselves were said to speak. When the knife fell, eternity nodded. In Egypt, terror did not merely guard power, it sanctified it. Consider the architecture of control. In many lands, punishment stood outside the temple. In Egypt, temple, palace, and tomb formed a single system. The living king spoke as a god. The dead king ruled from the dark. Priests were custodians of both realms. There was no boundary the ritual did not cross. Obedience became a circle without end. Symbols mattered. Where other cultures raised altars of stone, Egypt raised ecosystems of meaning. The ankh, the was scepter, the cobra crown, the sun disk, each icon doubled as an oath. Each oath carried an unspoken threat: break the order, and the order will break you. This was Ma'at sharpened to a blade. Even the Nile joined the ceremony. Floods were praised as blessings when they fed the fields. When they failed, priests read the water like a scroll. Offerings multiplied. Ritual tightened. Suffering grew. The people learned to measure their fear by the river's height. Across civilizations, a law emerges. When rulers claim to guard the cosmos, punishment becomes a sacrament. Pain becomes policy. Death becomes pedagogy. Egypt teaches the purest version of this lesson because divinity sat on the throne and slept in the tomb. In that closeness lies the difference. And in that difference lies the terror. Yet echoes persist. Centuries later, new empires would dress old methods in new words: security, stability, unity. The vocabulary shifts. The ritual remains. Public trials, confessions rehearsed, punishments timed for the crowd. The script does not age. It only changes costumes. Listen to the refrain. Fear organizes. Fear instructs. Fear remembers. A single spectacle can govern a generation. A single ritual can teach 1,000 quiet obediences. Egypt, Assyria, Rome, Tenochtitlan. Each understood the arithmetic. Terrify a few. Control the many. Call it sacred. Call it law. Call it survival. And still, a question burns beneath the sand and the stone. If so many worlds chose pain to speak for heaven, what did they fear losing? Order? Power? Faith itself? When rulers tremble, they reach for ritual. When ritual bleeds, the people learn to bow. We have walked far from the Nile, only to find the Nile again. Its current flows through the courts of kings, through stadiums of death, through plazas bright with torches. It winds into the present, quiet but unbroken. The names of gods fade. The grammar of fear endures. And now we return to Egypt, to the temple at night, to the tomb sealed with oaths, to the pharaoh whose voice could command both sunrise and silence. What began as offerings became instruments. What began as devotion became design. The echoes were never background. They were rehearsal. Because after the comparisons fall away, one truth remains. The most perfect union of faith and terror did not live in the margins. It sat on the throne. It breathed through the priesthood. It watched from the sarcophagus. And the ritual that bound it all together is the one we must now face. When power calls itself sacred, how far will it go to be obeyed? By now, the pattern is clear. Rituals of blood, ceremonies of pain, tombs sealed with sacrifice. Egypt did not stumble into these practices. It perfected them, because at the heart of it all was power. Power wrapped in gold, power carved in stone, power spoken with the voice of eternity. The pharaoh's divinity was more than belief. It was a weapon. It justified every act, no matter how cruel. It sanctified fear. It transformed violence into holiness. The people were told that the gods demanded obedience, and to disobey was to invite destruction, not only in life, but in the afterlife itself. This was the climax of Egypt's dark system. Faith and terror became one. Picture the scene. A temple filled with smoke and chanting. The crowd pressed together, heads lowered. At the center, a prisoner kneels, chains biting into his skin. Priests raise their hands. The pharaoh himself watches, expression hidden by the sacred crown. The whip cracks, the knife gleams, the ritual begins. The people see. They learn. They understand. Power is not only in the crown, it is in the fear that crown inspires. Every scream is a sermon. Every scar is a commandment. Every death is a law carved deeper into memory than any hieroglyph. The beauty of Egypt's monuments concealed this truth. The pyramids dazzled, the temples glowed. But behind the stone, in the shadows, fear ruled. Fear enforced obedience more tightly than armies. Fear held families silent. Fear turned neighbors into informers. The pharaoh did not need to watch every subject. He needed only to perform the rituals. The spectacle did the rest. The crowd saw punishment once and remembered it for life. The echo of a single ritual kept thousands obedient. That was the genius of fear. It multiplied itself. Priests used hymns to frame cruelty as balance. They told the people that pain restored Ma'at, the order of the universe. They claimed the gods demanded suffering as a price for harmony. And who could argue? To disagree was to risk being the next offering. Even kings beyond Egypt feared the pharaoh's aura. Foreign rulers sent tribute, not only to avoid war, but to show respect to a god who could wield both armies and curses. Pharaoh's reach extended beyond borders, carried on the whispers of his rituals. This was not just politics, it was theater, sacred theater. Every act designed to remind the people that resistance was useless, that the gods had already decided, that obedience was the only path to survival. And so, the system endured. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell. Yet the rituals remained, repeated in chambers lit by torchlight, carried out beneath statues that stared with unblinking eyes. The Nile flooded, fields flourished, temples thrived, and beneath it all, fear kept the order intact. The climax of Egypt's power was not the pyramid, not the temple, not the treasure. It was the ritual of fear, a ritual performed again and again, binding generations in silence. But power, once sanctified, is never satisfied. Fear, once unleashed, demands more. Rituals grew harsher, ceremonies darker. Whispers tell of acts so cruel that even loyal scribes dared not write them down. Acts erased from records, buried in sand, sealed in tombs. What we know is terrifying enough. But what we do not know, what remains hidden beneath stone and silence, may be worse. Because Egypt did not build monuments only for eternity, it built monuments for secrecy, and the sands have not given up all their secrets. Not yet. The sands of Egypt keep their silence. For every tomb uncovered, there are hundreds still buried. For every wall studied, there are chambers still sealed. For every secret revealed, there are countless more waiting in the dark. What we know of forbidden rituals comes in fragments. A broken inscription, a painting half erased, a burial pit filled with bodies whose deaths cannot be explained by nature alone. From these fragments we glimpse the truth, but the whole truth is still hidden. Perhaps it is better that way. The Egyptians were masters of secrecy. They knew how to cloak cruelty in gold, how to bury terror beneath stone. They wrote history for the living to see, but they also wrote another history, the history of shadows, the history of silence. That history still lies beneath the desert. Every discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. A row of retainers buried beside a king, a ritual text describing offerings of flesh, a curse carved to warn the curious away. Together, they form a picture darker than we imagined. A picture of power maintained not only with worship, but with fear sanctified as divine. Imagine what still lies hidden. Chambers sealed for 4,000 years, air trapped since the day the stones were set, altars stained with marks that are not only paint, bones that still bear the scars of knives and fire. If the desert gave up all its secrets, what horrors would step back into the light? We comfort ourselves by thinking these acts belong to the distant past, that the age of ritual sacrifice and sacred terror ended long ago. But the echoes remain, in every society that cloaks power and holiness, in every ruler who demands obedience not only with laws, but with fear. Egypt may be silent, but its lessons endure. The forbidden rituals remind us of a truth we would rather forget, that fear is timeless, that cruelty disguised as faith can outlive empires, that monuments of stone may crumble, but the memory of terror does not. The pharaohs are gone, their crowns are dust, their voices silent, yet their rituals whisper still, carried on the desert wind, waiting for ears to listen. The sands cover much, but they do not erase. And somewhere beneath the dunes, sealed away by time, there may be chambers where the torches have never gone out. Chambers where forbidden rituals are not only remembered, but preserved. What we have uncovered is only the surface. What remains buried may change everything we think we know about Egypt, about power, about faith, about fear. And so, we end where we began, with shadows beneath the golden light, with truths never meant to be told, with rituals that shaped an empire and haunted humanity. But the story is not finished, because as long as the sands keep their silence, questions remain. And the most terrifying truth of all may be this: we have not yet seen Egypt's darkest secrets.